Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Caleb Ryan's Vagrant. From what I understand, his feature film debut? Yes?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. So Caleb, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a filmmaker from Calgary, Alberta.
Mhm.
My mom is from Grenada, Caribbean island, Grenada. My dad is from Newfoundland in Canada. I went to film school in Calgary. I did a joint program between the University of Calgary and the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. And this is my debut feature.
Debut. Well, congratulations on an excellent debut. It's definitely, I've already seen that it's screened at a couple other places in Canada, so we're so happy to have the Ontario premiere. I guess the reason as to why I think this film is a huge feat is because you did it, you managed to make something that was very high quality and like a good film, a strong film, without the help of the majority of funders. A lot of people, in order to make a commercially viable film, rely on a lot of granting bodies in order to have that happen. And so I'm just curious about how the film came to be, because I understand it was a budget of $35,000. That's right, folks, $35,000. So please tell us how it came to be.
Yeah. Okay. Geez, where do I start? So the cinematographer Darian Trotman, I met him in film school. His family is from he was born in England, but his family is from Barbados.
Oh, cool.
Barbados.
Sorry?
A
Bayesian ting.
Yeah, Bayesian. I'm pretty sure Barbados. I don't want to Barbados, Bahamas. Oh my!
A Bahamian ting.
He's Caribbean. I don't want to get this wrong. I don't want him to see this. So I met him in film school, and I'm like, yeah, I got this idea. Let's make a movie. And he's like, okay. Before he even saw any of the words, he's like, okay, I'll do it. I'll be your DP. And you guys just watched the movie. You've seen the subject matter. You see what it was about. It might seem like something like that right now would be, a prime candidate for Canadian funding. But you have to remember that I started writing the script 2 years ago. And just in my mind, if I was like, hey, Canadian government, we're going to make this movie. We got a bunch of black filmmakers, black cast. It's about a homeless black alcoholic. That it just didn't seem that anyone the Canadian government, and this is no slight on the Canadian government, it's just I just figured that nobody would really be that would really want to support it. So I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to do it myself. It was even in the preliminary stages, people were like, oh, can he just be like someone of a different race, can he just, and I was like, no, this is
people had actually asked you to change the race to essentially whitewash your protagonist.
Well, just because it might be a little easier to, because some people think it's inflammatory to have if I tell you the story that it's like a black man that's a homeless man, it's like, oh, that is so disrespectful. But you've seen the movie. It is not a story about a homeless man. It's not, he's just homeless. That's just his circumstance. That is not who he is. Mm-hmm. So when I was explaining it to people, they're like, oh yeah, maybe, the funding aspect, you might want to change him to a different race so it's not as inflammatory. But I was like, no. And my mom was like, no, you keep this. I've had this story for 15 years. My mom's like, no, you got to keep it. And just so in Toronto, you guys have a really big black population. You guys have a huge pool to, if you want black actors. But here in Calgary, as you can imagine, we don't. So even to find Frank, we had all the locations, we had all the subsequent actors, we had all the other required actors, but to find that lead, a man in his 60s, a black man, was nearly impossible. We found him 2 weeks before we started shooting.
That's how it goes, man. I'm curious about one thing that you've mentioned, specifically inflammatory, because is it because like there are so few representations of Black men on screen that to have a Black man as a drunk, it seems like that's not the way we want to have the culture be seen. Is that like, were you getting the blowback from like colored people, or were you getting the blowback from white folks being like, we wouldn't necessarily be interested in this story because of the subject matter? So can you make the distinction for me?
Yeah. So it was basically talking to people about this story. It was like a touchy kind of subject matter of because in the history of cinema, you have seen that Black characters are these disparaged, cliched characters. You see that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And just to say that, just to have a Black main character is this. At the beginning, he's homeless and he's an alcoholic, but that's not who he is. But when I'm just explaining the story to people, it's like, hey, are you playing on these kind of stereotypes? Going to, right? So from the offset, it seems that it could be inflammatory, but it's as you watch the movie, that it's much more complicated than that. He's not just some guy that just enjoys drinking. Really, it's only
no. And like the thing that's interesting about it, I guess why I'm like trying to segue is because like twofold. So it's interesting because I've done a lot of work with reference to why there is a dearth of cinema created by BIPOC filmmakers in Canada. And it's very like auteur cinema is a very white space. So when you say, I didn't think that that the Canadian government would be interested in my idea, it's because, well, representation. If you don't see many people like yourself doing the thing or much content like what you'd like to do, there is also that being like, yeah, it's new and it's fresh, but will they be receptive to it considering the circumstances? So there's that, but also it's interesting because like what you're kind of tapping into is like really how a lot of people have found success, specifically like Issa Rae. She, like with the Black female, the strong black female, the one that can weather the storm, like the Viola Davis, stiff upper lip, like I can take it. Issa Rae was fed up with that idea of Black women and was like, I am not that. And then she created Awkward Black Girl, which then turned into what we know as Insecure, in a way of humanizing and being like, we are not. It's like, it's interesting because it almost seems like with your protagonist, you use his circumstances as a means to humanize him, because yes, there are Black male alcoholics out there who have had a hard time settling in a country that's far away from their own, where they don't necessarily have access to support systems. And so this is what happens sometimes. However, you do a wonderful way of managing to of showing a protagonist that's trying to rise above his circumstances and like looking for something more. So I find it very interesting that you like people would be like, oh, whoa, because it's just like, yeah, those people exist. And it's like, obviously you would have sensitivity toward the topic as opposed to like creating a caricature of like what this Black man is. So.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And yeah, like now when we look at it now, it kind of seems like it kind of seems kind of crazy to think about, because it's just it's in the it's in like the social milieu now with like the Black Lives Matter and everything. But when we were doing this, it really wasn't. There wasn't like,
Which
I was
is
like,
wild though, because when you say 2 years ago, 2018 is Black Panther and it's Moonlight. But I do think, especially because Canada, like we are still trying to establish our own like understanding of our culture, and because we're so close to the US, like I feel like we take lessons and take things a little bit slower. Like we're just a little bit behind. But it's interesting because you mentioned the BLM explosion of the summer, because another thing I wanted to segue into was your representation of law enforcement in the film. And I'm curious about the inception of that when you were writing it, because it does seem to be very progressive and ahead of the conversation about defunding the police. For those of you at home that don't necessarily understand what this means, defunding the police doesn't necessarily mean like taking all the money away from the police. It means like restructuring how we see policing, meaning because like more often than not, most cases like where police are called are not robberies or murders or rapes. Like it's not that. And so I'm just curious about what you have done with treating the police and treating authoritative figures, even though it's still your film still highlights a very flawed system. I'm curious about how you wrote law enforcement, because it's a very very innovative and ahead of the time.
Yeah. For in terms of like innovation and ahead of its time, I'm not gonna take too much. I wasn't a psychic or by any means, but
No, it's very true.
when you're writing a script, it's important that you're not reactionary. So you see a whole bunch of movies that they're reactionary to things that are happening. A lot of the times when you're just writing things up based off of what is happening, right now, just for the process of filmmaking, a year or two, it might just be out of fashion, or out of whatever. Or it might be derivative, right? But when you're writing, it's best to write just from your heart, just from what you see. You mentioned Moonlight, which is 2 years ago. I watched Moonlight 3 times in the theaters. It was, you see these characters that are deeply flawed, and they're from the Black community, right? There's not, and by deeply flawed, I mean they're going in some, they're experiencing inner tumult, and I was like, geez, I'm like, it had such an effect on me, and I'm like, like we can, because I had this idea for 15 years, and I'm like, this is, and it kind of got the gears rolling. I'm like, there is an audience for this. I don't know if there's a Canadian audience for it, but there is an audience for it, and I had this character already in my mind, so I started writing it. But to answer the question about the police and everything, or the law enforcement, their bylaw officers, it was kind of tricky. When I was writing it, we needed they kind of serve as forces of antagonism in
Mm-hmm.
parts. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, at the beginning, when they first see each other and they're like, oh, it's Frank again. It's just to show that Frank is known to them. There was actually a scene afterwards where they're talking in their vehicle and they're doing all this kind of back and forth, but we eliminated it kind of just to make him kind of just to take away this relationship between the officers and him. Because you see a whole bunch of like you'd see all these kind of like buddy movies where the cops are buddies with whoever, but I'm like, oh, this doesn't seem very realistic, right? Like they're just doing their job. And even in the courtroom where one of the officers is getting where he's on the stand, and you can see that he's saying like, okay, this guy made a difference, he changed his life around, but he's still doing his job, right? He's not going to just
Of course. But I think, and that's like what was interesting where you highlight, like, because because of the fact that the 2 bylaw officers came with somebody, the woman, I forget her name, but she was like the person that was like the one to like the watchdog, for lack of a better phrase, for animal protection services. The very fact that those people came with somebody that's specialized in the area of what the call would be for is incredibly progressive, A. And then B, when you say, oh, Frank is known, like there are a couple of things where I'm like where they knew who Frank was. Like a lot of the calls for changing of policing is like having people that actually understand and know the community, working in the community, so that like they can like operate with a level of I'm at a loss for the word, but operate with a level of understanding. Like, oh, this is Frank and he's just having a bad day. He's not usually like this, as opposed to like running for your gun in order to like like when you have an existing relationship between somebody, de-escalation, I think, is so much more. I feel like it's easier, as opposed to like running to like grab your gun. So I guess like that was one of the biggest things for me, where I feel like you're like, I'm not taking credit for that, but like, especially given the climate of what's happening, especially when I watched it, I've watched it again since, but when I programmed it specifically, I was at the height of the BLM stuff. At the height of the explosion of the BLM movement that is like now we're seeing is going to be a revolution. And so I just thought that was very poignant and specific. And like to your credit. The last question I have for you is kind of twofold. So I really loved the way it was broken up into chapters, and I thought that was kind of like innovative and new, like you doing your own thing. Sometimes you see that, but like not in the way in which you did it, which I thought was interesting because there are more chapters. I think the closest thing I'd seen like was The Favorite, where there are a lot of chapters. from a technical standpoint, can you talk a bit about your process? Like, I know that you had a hard time finding your lead, Frank. So, like, was the story all about Frank, or like, was it hard to, like, was there a location that you definitely needed? Like, can you talk about, like, from a technical standpoint, from film school, like, with use of the camera, like, what your choices were, what informed your choices, and like that kind of thing?
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to condense it all very quickly for you. Okay. Technically,
Don't worry
okay.
about time. It's fine.
So for all the actors, like I said, it was very hard to find people of color actors, and but one thing you learn in film school is don't really cast people because they're just so hard and unpredictable and for directing them. So so for instance, in the VHS footage.
Okay.
Okay, in the VHS.
Yeah.
The flashbacks, basically. We actually filmed that on a high-8 camera, so it was VHS footage. We had to transfer to digital. In those scenes, the person who plays young Frank is actually our cinematographer. The reason being,
way to get resourceful, man.
Yeah, the reason being is because we had a guy that was playing that role, and last minute he couldn't do it. Like he was underage. His mom was. You guys just watched the movie. You know what happens at the very end. His mom kind of was not down with the ending, and because it's a sad story.
Yeah.
So we were out of luck, like a day or two before, and we were already.
You're kidding.
Yeah, and we were already shooting, right? So we did the VHS footage at the very last day. We actually improvised everything because, like your old home videos, they're they're not scripted. They're just like, oh, hey, wave to the camera. So we made the whole thing improvised.
Yeah.
We needed somebody right away. And Darian, he was so happy to shoot this on VHS, but he's like, you know what? I'll do it. We went to Value Village. He had to cut his hair up. The woman, his mom?
Yeah.
That's my mom.
Oh, I love that. I think that's just really getting resourceful, because if you want to make a thing, you want to make a thing. And then even just talking about, like, through the means of, like, the language of cinema, like VHS, like, I think VHS is a really interesting choice cinematically, because, like, it's like something, it's kind of, well, VHS recordings are antiquated, and, like, you're trying to flash back to the past, and, like, you do a lovely job of weaving that through. I guess the last question before we go is, what did you want to say with your film, or what opinion of the world did you want to offer audiences with your film? I think I have an understanding, but for the masses, what did you want to say about your view of the world?
Okay. Basically, okay, when I was writing this script, I was reading a lot of I guess you'd classify it as existentialist books. Like I was reading Dostoevsky and Camus at the time, and it was kind of they kind of settle in the realm of like existential nihilism, that life just basically has no intrinsic meaning, right? But as I was reading these books, because I was like, yeah, things happen. Bad things can happen to good people. Let's just keep on, let's just explore that. But life, there is meaning to life. Like you give yourself kind of meaning. You give things meaning, and it was kind of without. It's like man's search of meaning. Not to steal Frankel's title, but yeah, it was. I don't want to get too heavily into it because I went to a Q&A a couple years ago when a director explained to me his meaning of a movie, and it was contrary to what my meaning was. And I was like, what? I'm like, this is what you meant by it? And I was kind of sad. Like, I want people to take whatever they want out of it.
That's fair.
But yeah, it's kind of like one man's kind of his redemption and his sacrifice for the greater of good. And you cannot, as people of color, you're kind of judged at face value. There's this miscarriage of justice on him. He was an alcoholic before. Look at him now. He can't change. That people are capable of change, and even with these flashbacks, you don't know what people have gone through, and their circumstances, and you really just can't judge people at face value.
Like, I think yeah, I feel like one of the things I had written in my program notes was that we conflate, I don't know if conflate is the right word, but confuse values with value of a person, if that makes sense. And like the exactly miscarriage of justice that happened to Frank, where it's like because he was low in society or like an alcoholic, that he is capable of doing all bad things and incapable of good. And so I think you did a beautiful job of creating a really compelling film. I loved it. Congratulations. And yeah, thank you so much to all of the audience members watching at home. We thank you for your viewership. Thank you for watching Caleb's film. And thank you for your support of BIPOC filmmakers. Yeah, 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 yeah. So that's it. Caleb, say bye.
Bye.